Hello again, everybody. This is Derek, and I am coming back at you with another wargaming and miniature video. And in today's video, we're continuing on with our Land of the Free boot camp. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about orders and commanders. All right, so let's get into it real quick. Now, I've already got a couple of videos up. If you want to go back and watch those before we get into this, I recommend it. And let's get into it. Orders. The battlefields of the 18th and 19th centuries were dominated by armies attempting to outmaneuver one another in order to push the enemy from the field. Battles were often not a measure of how many casualties could be inflicted, but rather challenging the enemy's resolve and willingness to continue to fight. Armies of the day spent an excessive amount of time training to create a battlefield ballet of maneuvers seeking to gain one advantage, forcing the enemy to withdraw. As a commander, you, the player, will have to manage the types of maneuvers that are performed by each of your elements and combine these actions with the appropriate fire and melee. Utilizing proper resources is only one part of the commanding a force. And knowing when to push the troops a little further walks the fine line between victory and defeat. Okay, active and passive. The player who has initiative will nominate a group commander and his elements to assign orders. The group commander will select one element within his group to receive orders. The element becomes the active element, and the rest of the elements on the table, including the enemy elements, are considered to be passive or inactive elements. How many groups and elements are activated is discussed in detail below. Okay, understanding orders. When an element is activated, it will place a marker or dice representing the maneuver and combat orders the player. Okay, so every unit has a number of maneuver orders and a number of combat orders it can perform. So by placing these dice down, two different colored dice might be better, one for maneuver and one for combat. And then as you perform these orders, you can reduce the die until you've used them all. The player must announce whether the group commander or the force commander is issuing the orders. The force commander may only issue orders if he is not already attached to an element. If the player fails to mention which commander they are using, it is assumed that it's the group commander. During the element's activation, the commander issuing the orders must remain constant, and the player may not switch commanders. The active element will use its maneuver and combat order values to perform actions until either the element runs out of orders or the player halts its actions. Each time an element is given a new order or action, it must verify that it is within the sphere of influence of the commander that is ordering the element, or the element cannot receive the order. Hint: commanders are not moved until after the elements in a group have finished their actions, and force commanders do not move until the end of the turn. So you might want to position your commanders strategically each turn to enable elements to maneuver more effectively. Each element, when activated, may perform actions as long as it starts each order within the ordering commander's sphere of influence, or until it has spent all of its maneuver and combat orders. An element can perform orders in any sequence as long as it does not exceed your order values. When an element is activated, the commander may use its command points to influence the element further as long as it's within the sphere of influence. An active element cannot use command points from a commander that has not been issuing the orders, or if the group commander is attached to a passive element. Command points are explained further in the command section. So you activate the group commander, who in turn activates one element, and then that one element performs all of its actions. Forced orders. Command points will allow elements to perform actions above and beyond their normal order allowance. If an element uses all of its allotted maneuver or combat orders, then the commander issuing the orders may spend one command point to force an order. Pushing an element has its rewards as well as its consequences. So each time a command point is spent to perform a forced order beyond the normal allowance, the element must make a morale test with modifiers prior to performing the forced order. If the test is passed, the element may use the combat point to perform either a maneuver or combat order. As long as the morale test is passed, the commander may continue to use as many command points as the player requires, but each time a point is spent, a new morale test must be immediately taken. If the morale test is failed, the element will receive a disorder marker and will not be able to perform the requested order. The element will immediately end its turn, and any unspent maneuver or combat orders are lost. Okay, let's talk about maneuver orders. Each type of element, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, has the ability to select from a range of maneuver orders. 1 point of maneuver is spent for each action that is performed. An element ordered to move will always measure from its leader's base. The rest of the element will maintain its formation around the leader once it is moved. This may cause certain stands to move slightly further than is permitted, but this is perfectly legitimate to maintain cohesion. So the guys on the outside of a wheel are running. Okay, spend 1 maneuver point to move the element in one of the following ways. The first one, move forward within the element's arc of sight. Remember the arc of sight, which is 45 degrees? The element may move forward and face in any direction as long as the facing does not extend past the starting arc of sight. In reality, this maneuver would take time to execute, and changing the element's facing on the battlefield would normally be considered a wheel. The player does not need to worry about measuring the element for wheeling because the movement rules have been designed purposefully to keep the flow of the game moving quickly. Place the measuring device from the leader in the direction the element would like to move, and as long as the facing does not extend past the element's arc of sight, then move the leader followed by the rest of the element's stand. For each new maneuver, the player must check the arc of sight and continue to move and face in the new direction. Okay, so I've got a unit here, and my arc of sight is actually measured from the outer edge of the element, and then I move my leader. As long as the leader is still within the arc of sight and facing in any direction, I can do that, and then this guy would fly all the way around to there, and this guy would move to there. And that's just for ease of play and speed of play. Okay, let's bring this guy back. I'm really utilizing the 24th here. The 24th was the guys that were at the Rorke's Drift. Oblique move. During an element's maneuver order, either moving in a forward direction or standing still, the player may elect to shift the element by one stand to the left or right. This oblique move may be performed at any stage during the movement. Okay, so I issue this element to move, right? And I've decided to move this guy up. But instead of bringing both of them up online, I can elect to shift one base to either the left or right. And if I do that, I'll just go ahead and adjust the leader, put him back in the center. So it's kind of like the unit moved up echelon, right? Echelon to the left and right. But in this case, it's measuring the echelon as a base width. Move backwards within the flank. Elements may spend a maneuver to move backwards while maintaining their facing. Although the movement allowance is quite small, it reflects the difficulty of maintaining the cohesion of the element and irregularity of the order during combat. The movement backwards would be performed exactly the same manner as forward, but the unit may not perform an oblique move when moving backwards. Okay, there's something called a turn or change facing. An element will often turn to its left or right or about face in order to quickly adjust its position or remove itself from a dangerous situation. Turning is a clever way of changing formation if the element has space issues and does not want to risk reforming into another element or area terrain. For example, when turning an element, the player will turn each stand 90 or 100 degrees and redress the ranks around the leader as needed. The leader will not move, but merely turn. Okay, so what they're saying is, this guy will turn, this guy will turn, and then this guy will turn. Now you'll notice there's a gap, and then you just push these guys in towards the leader. Only be conducted if the target lies within the clear line of sight and within the element's arc of sight. A charge move is two normal movements broken up by a pause in between. If there are no factors that prevent the element from completing the second movement, it will take the element into contact with the target enemy element. Elements in march column or Indian file, as well as artillery elements, will never be able to declare a charge. A charge can only be declared if the target element is determined to be in range and within the line of sight. Charge moves are detailed later in the melee section. Reload. Once an element has fired, a marker or puff of cotton is placed in front or next to the element to reflect that the element has unloaded its weapons or fired. The cost for an element to reload is one maneuver order. Remove the puff of smoke or marker when the element has spent a maneuver order to reload. This element is ready to fire once it has reloaded its weapons. Okay, so let's say you get 3 fire orders and 3 maneuver orders. You fire with the combat order, you reload with the maneuver order, then you fire with the combat order, then you reload with the maneuver order, and you go back and forth like that. Okay, formation change. An element requires a maneuver order to perform a change in formation. When an element decides to change formation during play, the leader will remain stationary throughout the maneuver, and the stands of the element will be reformed around the leader to create the new formation. The leader will maintain its facing as the additional stands of the element will form around the leader, facing in the same direction as the leader. When reforming the stands around the leader, an equal number of stands will move to the sides or front and rear depending on which formation you're taking. This may cause stands to move closer or further away from the enemy, reform into or out of area terrain, or accidentally occupy the same space as a friendly element. Each of these situations will be covered in more detail later in their appropriate section. A single stand element is always considered to be an open order formation, but may change formation into a march column. An element consisting of one stand can be marked to reflect the change in formation. If this guy wanted to change formation to open order, the leader doesn't move and the outside stands just go into open order. If they wanted to move from a battle line into a march column, you would just put one unit in front of the leader and one unit behind the leader, because remember, the leader doesn't move. Cavalry. Mount or dismount. Mounted elements have the flexibility during play to mount or dismount their horses depending on the circumstances of the situation. Elements must be purchased or fielded as mounted cavalry elements in order to perform mounts or dismounts. Mounting and dismounting each require a maneuver order to perform, but may not be performed during the same action. So you can't dismount, shoot, and then remount. Horses are held for several handlers in a safe location, and it takes time for the horses to be recalled. Cavalry may start the game dismounted and mount their horses at any time during their activation throughout the game. Players should have a marker or a handler stand representing the horses. The marker or stand should be placed behind the element in base contact with the dismounted stands. The marker represents the horses will prevent any player confusion if there's also dismounted elements in play that were purchased as infantry elements. So you can get dragoons as foot dragoons, and if you buy them as foot dragoons, they don't have the horse handler. But if you've got mounted dragoons and you want to dismount them, you'll also have to have the foot dragoon models, and by doing that, you'll put a horse handler behind them, letting everyone on the table know that they're actually able to remount. When an element is ordered to mount, remove the stand or marker and replace the leader on foot with the mounted version. Remove all the dismounted stands and form the remaining mounted stands around the leader. Ensure that the facing and formation remain the same. It is understandable that the dismounted bases and mounted bases may not be the same size. If they are different sizes, it is best not to place the element closer to the enemy. In my case, the cavalry stands are exactly the same as the infantry stand size, so there would be no problem with that. But at larger scale figures, the infantry might be on 40 squares and the cavalry might be on something like 50 squares, and so it would be a different size. Enter, move through, or exit area terrain. So we got enter, move through, or exit area terrain. Elements entering, moving through, and exiting area terrain spend a maneuver action to move, but may suffer penalties depending upon the different types of formations that you're currently maintaining. We'll have to refer to the scenery section to figure that out. Now remember that a unit that failed a morale check for backing up might have received a disorder marker. But there are instances during combat when ranks and files of an element may become disordered, disjointed, and begin to reduce the fighting quality of the unit. For each maneuver order the element spends, it may remove one disorder marker. As an element suffers disorder markers, there are two opportunities when you may remove them. When an element is activated, and it has existing disorder markers, the element must use every maneuver order available to the element to remove as many of the disorder markers as possible before it can perform any other orders. The other instance when a player can remove disorder markers is during the element's activation. If the element suffers a disorder marker during its activation, the player may spend a maneuver order for each disorder marker they would like to remove. Okay, so disorder markers, those are not hits. Those are something completely different. That just means the element is a little confused on where it's moving and how it's positioned. You'll need to find a way to mark disordered. And I might use a green to represent disorder. And these, you can build these up and get a number of them. But each turn you activate, you'll expend your 3 or 4 maneuver actions to get rid of those disorders. Store a maneuver action. If an element has any remaining maneuver orders after it has completed its actions, it may store one maneuver order for future use. The maneuver order can be stored to issue a future counter charge against enemy element. Well, that's in the melee section. When we get there, we'll go over that. Another thing is crossing a linear obstacle. Infantry and cavalry elements attempting to cross a linear obstacle will need to spend a maneuver order to successfully navigate the obstacle. Elements will be able to cross a linear obstacle that is no taller than the height of the miniatures on foot. So like a fence or a wall or something like that. Okay. An element in battle line or open order will move into contact with the linear obstacle and stop, regardless of the amount of movement it has remaining. The next maneuver order will move the entire element to the opposite side of the linear obstacle, and the element will receive a disorder marker. So crossing a linear obstacle causes a disorder. The element may continue to receive orders, even forced orders, after crossing a linear obstacle. An element in march column requires 2 maneuver actions to cross a linear obstacle. Place the entire element on the opposite side of the linear obstacle once both maneuver actions have been spent. An element with 1 maneuver action may be given a forced order for the second maneuver to cross the linear obstacle. If the morale test for the forced order is failed, the element will remain in base contact with the linear obstacle and receive its disorder marker, unable to move. Once the element march column has crossed the linear obstacle, it will receive a disorder marker and may continue to receive orders as normal. An element will never hang on a linear obstacle, nor will it ever have a portion of it stands on one side and a portion of it stands on the other side. The entire element will be on one side of a linear obstacle or the other. If the element does not have enough maneuver orders to cross, then it must wait until it has enough maneuver orders to do so. Okay, so if this cab unit moved up to this linear obstacle, it would immediately form to the linear obstacle. That's one maneuver. Then its second maneuver is to cross, and once it crosses, it receives its disorder marker, just one. Now here's a big chart or a big page that I'm going to show off so that you can see the different orders and how they apply. You have change formation and reload. That applies to everything, even artillery. Infantry and cavalry elements can turn, store, cross a linear obstacle. Now, infantry maneuvers, here we go. Move 1 inch backwards. Move 3 inch with an oblique in battle line or open order to the front. So for one action, you're moving 3 inches. Move 6 inches if you're in march column. And move 6 inches for a charge. Charging movement is broken into 2 movements of 3 for each pause, because there might be a countercharge or there might be a snap fire. That's why you move 3 inches, the enemy gets to react, and then you finish with the rest of your movement. Cavalry maneuvers. 3 inch backwards, 6 inch with an oblique, or 9 inch in a march column, or 12 inch in a charge. Or you can dismount or mount. Okay, artillery. They move 9 inches if they're limbered, or 3 inches if you're unlimbered. So, yes, you can move guns unlimbered. It's just slow. It's actually kind of the same as infantry, 3 inches. Or you can move 1 inch unlimbered if you're a heavy gun. That's larger than 12 pounds. And then there's element restrictions. Can't move through impassable terrain. You cannot reload if you're limbered. Artillery cannot cross linear obstacles. And artillery cannot charge. Okay, those were the maneuver elements, maneuver orders. Now we're going into combat orders. There's only a couple. Fire a volley or fight in melee. Firing once with an element requires one combat order. When an element fires, place a puff of smoke in the direction of the shot or a marker to represent that it's fired. An element may only shoot at the closest enemy element as long as it has line of sight and the target is within the arc of sight. The element does not need to start its activation within the line of sight as long as the element maneuvers prior to shooting. So it can turn for the maneuver and then shoot. Okay, fighting in melee. When an element declares a charge and moves into contact with the target, it must spend a combat order to engage one round of melee. An element may continue to fight additional rounds of melee if enemy elements remain in contact, as long as it has combat orders to initiate another melee. There's also store a combat action. If an element has a remaining combat order after it has completed all of its orders, it may store one for future use. The combat order can be stored for a future snap fire to interrupt an enemy's actions, but only if the element has loaded weapons when the combat order is stored. More details about snap fires are in the shooting section. Group orders. There is an instance when a commander needs to rapidly deploy his troops and a very general order is issued. These orders are not very detailed, so even the most incompetent commander can manage to complete the task. A commander may issue a group order to any or all of its elements within his group as long as all of the elements begin and end their actions within his sphere of influence. The player needs to identify which elements will be participating in the group order, and they must remain as part of the group order until the end of the turn. Only a single group order may be issued per group per turn, but not every element in the group needs to participate. The group order may proceed or follow individual element orders within the group, but the group commander cannot issue a group order if he is attached to an element. The force commander may issue a group order as long as that group has not or does not intend to issue another group order using the group commander. The elements participating in the group order will receive a number of maneuver and combat orders equal to the lowest value within the group. So if you've got like a militia compared to an elite crack unit, everybody would be using the militia's values. So effectively, the lowest maneuver value and the lowest combat value could be taken from completely different elements. The element involved in a group order must perform all of the same actions for each order, and the element is unable or unwilling to perform the action, it will receive a hold order. A hold order is simply an element performing no action. So for example, if the group is ordered to reload and one of the elements already has its weapons reloaded, then it will hold and wait for the next order. If the group is ordered to move, then they all must move or hold if they are unwilling or unable to move. Distances and directions for moving does not matter as long as they remain within the commander's sphere of influence. So yeah, they can move around. If the group is ordered to fire, then the player will conduct each shooting order separately as if each element were firing independently. Elements that are part of a group may store combat and maneuver orders for snapfire and countercharges, but all of the elements must perform the same order, storing a combat order, for example. That gets everybody in the group to act similarly, but simultaneously. So that's really cool. Okay, storing maneuvers and combat orders. Intelligent officers spend their time evaluating the surroundings and battlefield conditions to maneuver their troops in the most advantageous positions. The rules enable players to prepare their forces by anticipating movements and countercharges. You may elect to store a maneuver order, a combat order, or both. No more than one maneuver or one combat order may be stored for each element. And if the player stores any combination, this will end its element's activation. Essentially, players will want to store their orders at the end of the activation so that they can maximize their orders. You may choose to use a stored maneuver or combat order whenever an enemy element has concluded an action within your threat zone. The active element's orders are temporarily interrupted, allowing the element with the stored order to perform either a snapfire or countercharge. A single element may only perform a snapfire or countercharge when reacting to an executed order, but the element may react using both stored orders if the active element performs more than one order within the threat zone. Okay, so what he's saying is, if this guy moves, he's within his threat zone, so if he decides to move, that's one order, I can shoot. And then if he moves again, I can countercharge. But I can't shoot and countercharge if he only spends one order within my threat zone. Multiple elements with stored orders may react to the same action, but the orders are performed and resolved one at a time before moving on to the next snapfire or countercharge. The controlling player may select in which sequence the orders are performed. You may carefully plan to ensure that one snapfire or countercharge does not ruin other opportunities. Maneuver or combat orders are removed from the element when they are used to perform a snap or countercharge. If an element with a stored order fails a morale test, then all stored orders are immediately removed. Finally, when an element activates to receive orders, it immediately removes any stored orders, like from turn to turn. After the snapfire and counter charges have been performed, the active element may continue to receive orders as normal unless it fails a morale test or is forced to withdraw. An active element that fails a morale test and is forced to withdraw will end its activation immediately. Snapfire counter charge. Players may have an element with a stored combat order fire a volley when the active element executes an order within the threat zone. Once the volley has been fired, the results and subsequent morale tests are applied immediately before the active element continues to receive orders. Okay, we know that. Countercharge. An element with a stored maneuver order may declare a countercharge against active elements that completed an order within your threat zone. Interpenetration. Throughout the course of engagements, soldiers will open gaps in their battle lines to allow other friendly units to pass unhindered through the ranks. This would enable fresh soldiers to engage the exhausted enemy, often tipping the scales in favor. The passive element is considered a linear obstacle for a friendly active element wishing to perform an interpenetration. The procedure for interpenetration of friendly element are exactly the same as crossing a linear obstacle, with a few exceptions. An element in battle line or open order will move up to contact with the passive friendly element and stop. The next maneuver order will move the entire element to the opposite side of the passive element, and then both the active and passive elements will receive a disorder marker. The active element may continue to receive orders, even forced orders, from the commander after interpenetration of friendly element. An element in march column requires 2 maneuver actions to interpenetrate a friendly element. It's the same as an obstacle. Place the entire element on the opposite side of the passive element. Once both maneuver actions have been spent, an element with 1 maneuver action remaining may be given a forced order for the second. On a failed order, it receives a disorder marker and unable to conduct. And once it's successfully interpenetrated, both the active and passive will receive a disorder. It's the same. The active element will never occupy the same space as another element, nor will it ever have a portion of its stands on one side of the passive element and a portion of it stands on the other side. The entire element will be on one side. If the element does not have enough maneuver orders to interpenetrate the passive element, then it must wait. If the passive element is in open order, then neither the passive element nor the active element will suffer the disorder. So it's still an obstacle, but you don't suffer the disorder marker. Accidental interpenetration of elements. Elements may often move into a situation where they will accidentally interpenetrate another element. This incident could include an element reforming, wheeling, turning to face the target when shooting, or withdrawing. If any part of their element involved is interpenetrated, or if any part of the element stops its movement on another element, then all the elements involved suffer disorder. The moving element must continue its move in order to occupy its own space on the table, and then withdrawing into enemy elements. There may be instances during a game when a player is forced to withdraw an element and it comes into contact with an enemy element. The withdrawing element will immediately stop when it comes into contact with the enemy element and it receives a disorder marker. The withdrawing element and enemy element it came into contact with are now considered to be in melee, with the withdrawing element considered to have charged the enemy element. Follow all the normal rules for charging into contact and initiating a melee. Okay, and that will be discussed in the melee chapter. That was the orders maneuver orders, forced orders, combat orders, what they are, formation changes, orders by elements, group orders, interpenetration. And in the next video, we'll talk about our commanders and how they influence the battle, attaching and unattaching commanders, etc. All right, so thank you for coming out and watching this. Sorry for my camera deactivating and reactivating. I think I got that situation resolved. So I'll catch you in the next video.